Yesterday, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood in front of a bank of microphones in Toronto and delivered the most consequential infrastructure threat in a generation. He didn't issue a standard diplomatic protest. He didn't ask Ottawa to file a complaint under the USMCA trade agreement. Instead, he weaponized a utility bill by imposing a 25% surcharge on all electricity exports to the United States on March 10, 2025. A single Canadian province effectively extracted $400,000 daily from American households. Within 48 hours, the White House blinked. This is not routine political posturing. This is the disclosure of a hidden architectural leverage point in North American trade. Most mainstream outlets are reporting this as a temporary regional spat over utility rates, but they are completely missing the strategic logic. This was a deliberate, synchronized counteroffensive that completely redefines how middle powers can neutralize aggressive tariff policies from a dominant trading partner. If this channel adds value to your strategic and financial thinking, make sure you're subscribed to Money Signals right now for clear, fact-driven analysis. What occurred in March 2025 permanently changed the rules of engagement in economic warfare. To understand how Canada arrived at this flashpoint, we have to strip away the official rhetoric and look at the sequence of decisions that forced Ontario's hand. The tariff catalyst, a coordinated first strike the conflict, did not begin in Toronto. It began with a sweeping policy shift in Washington. US President Donald Trump entered his second term with a singular, highly telegraphed economic weapon: universal import duties. On March 4, 2025, those promises crystallized into devastating state policy for America's northern neighbor. The White House bypassed standard consultative channels and slapped a 25% blanket tariff on the vast majority of Canadian imports. Simultaneously, a separate 10% penalty was levied specifically against Canadian energy exports. The surface-level narrative from Washington framed this as an America First mechanism to correct trade imbalances. The deeper strategic reality was an attempt to force immediate concessions from Ottawa on immigration, border security, and supply chain alignment. The initial shock to the Canadian economy was severe, but the institutional response from Ottawa was immediate and highly aggressive. The federal government did not sue for peace. It mobilized a 30 billion Canadian dollar retaliatory tariff package, translating to roughly $21 billion in US counter-firepower. Ottawa's initial target list was designed for maximum political pain in key congressional districts, striking at highly visible American consumer products, agricultural and consumer goods, orange juice, peanut butter, coffee, and household appliances, manufacturing and lifestyle sectors, motorcycles, footwear, cosmetics, and specific pulp and paper products. This was a classic textbook retaliation strategy. It was coordinated, it was aggressive, and it was entirely predictable. But while Ottawa was playing by the traditional rules of trade diplomacy, Doug Ford was looking at a completely different part of the chessboard. He understood that a trade war centered on peanut butter and footwear is a war of attrition that Canada would ultimately lose due to sheer asymmetric scale. To win, Canada needed an asymmetric weapon, something indispensable, irreplaceable, and immediate. Ford looked at the physical infrastructure connecting Ontario to the American Midwest and realized he was sitting on the master switch. The kinetic leverage of the cross-border grid, the underlying architecture of North American energy, is not a product of recent trade deals. It is a physical reality built over more than a century of deep integration. More than 30 major high-voltage transmission lines cross the international border daily, operating as a single, synchronized machine. In 2023 alone, American utilities purchased $3.2 billion worth of electricity from Canada, importing enough aggregate power to keep the lights on in 5.6 million American homes. Ontario's grid specifically plugs directly into the industrial heartlands of Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. This is not merely a commercial relationship. It is a critical vulnerability that Washington failed to calculate when it drafted its tariff memos. There is a fundamental structural difference between consumer goods and primary energy utilities. Tariffs on manufactured imports are diffuse. They filter slowly through corporate supply chains, taking weeks or months to manifest as inflation on retail shelves. Energy is kinetic. If you restrict or tax electricity, The financial hit lands instantly, directly, and unavoidably on the consumer. Energy runs the fundamental systems of modern society: hospitals, water treatment facilities, regional rail networks, and schools. When Doug Ford stepped to the podium on March 6th and announced that the Independent Electricity System Operator would implement a 25% surcharge effective Monday, March 10th, he transformed a public utility into a highly precise geopolitical instrument. The mechanics of the surcharge were ruthlessly efficient. A fee of 10 Canadian dollars per megawatt hour, roughly $7 US, was tacked onto every single unit of electricity exported across Ontario's southern border. The province calculated that this single administrative lever would extract between $208,000 and $278,000 in pure premium daily for the 1.5 million American families hooked into Ontario's power lines. The mathematics translated to an immediate $100 monthly increase on their household utility bills. Collectively, that represents a $150 million monthly tax directly on working-class American voters in critical, swing-adjacent political territories. Ford's public warning was absolute. "I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut it off completely." The threat to shut it off completely sent an immediate shockwave through Wall Street. Because financial markets understand the difference between a trade dispute and a systemic infrastructure crisis. Market chaos and the White House escalation by the morning of Monday, March 10th. The broader tariff war had already pushed US equity markets into severe turbulence. The initial Canadian retaliatory package had dragged the Dow Jones Industrial Average down by more than 649 points, while the S&P 500 suffered its sharpest single-day rout of 2025 when Ontario's electricity surcharge went live on March 11th. The market decline accelerated. The Dow shed an additional 478 points in a single session, the S&P 500 dropped nearly 0.8%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq fell further into correction territory. By the close of that trading week, approximately $4 trillion in total market capitalization had been wiped out globally. The White House reacted with immediate rhetorical volatility via Truth Social. The administration called the move a direct threat against innocent American families and immediately attempted to apply a traditional counter-tariff strategy. The initial response was a matching 25% duty on Canadian electricity imports, but when it became clear that a tax on imports would only further burden American utilities, the administration shifted to a much more dangerous economic lever. The Commerce Department was instructed to double down, raising tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from the baseline of 25% up to an unprecedented 50% total. This was an incredibly high-stakes gamble. Canada is America's largest foreign supplier of structural metals, providing 41% of all aluminum and nearly 25% of all iron and steel imported by the United States annually. In the preceding fiscal year, these supply chains represented $11.4 billion in aluminum and $7.6 billion in iron and steel. Slapping a 50% penalty on these essential industrial inputs was not a calculated negotiating tactic. It was an economic grenade detonated inside the American manufacturing sector. Industrial leaders immediately sounded the alarm. The CEO of Alcoa, William Oplinger, had previously warned that even a 25% duty on Canadian aluminum risked erasing 100,000 American jobs. The domestic aluminum sector directly employs 164,000 workers and indirectly supports another 272,000 positions in downstream construction, aerospace, automotive, and mining operations. Doubling that tariff meant threatening the structural viability of the entire US industrial base. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers went public on social media, labeling the 50% metal tariff the worst piece of trade policy in recent history, a completely self-inflicted wound to the domestic economy. The asymmetric breakdown of tariff economics. This escalation exposed the fundamental flaw in the administration's trade rhetoric. The core principle that mainstream economic commentary consistently fails to explain to the public is this: tariffs are not an international invoice paid by the exporting nation. They are a domestic tax collected at ports of entry, paid entirely by the domestic companies doing the importing. When a 50% tariff is slapped on Canadian aluminum, Rio Tinto or Alcoa of Canada do not write a check to the US Treasury. The American manufacturing plant in Michigan or Ohio pays that 50% premium when the raw material crosses the border. That cost then cascades down the supply chain, forcing domestic auto manufacturers, aerospace firms, and consumer goods companies to either absorb catastrophic margin compression or pass the bill directly to the American consumer. The broader corporate fallout during that critical week in March 2025 demonstrates how tightly wound these cross-border supply chains truly are. Automotive giants. Shares of Ford Motor Company and General Motors both plunged by approximately 3% in a single Tuesday session, reflecting their vulnerability to disrupted North American parts networks, aviation and logistics. Delta Airlines cut its first quarter profit guidance by 50%, citing rising industrial uncertainty, while American Airlines projected a significantly wider loss than consensus estimates. Doxomza Retail. Kohl's saw its stock price crater by 23% in a matter of days after lowering its annual comparable sales outlook due to macroeconomic anxiety, while the broader American economy was bleeding billions in market value. Ontario was calmly collecting its $243,000 daily surplus from the electricity surcharge. The economic asymmetry was staggering. A regional utility penalty generating less than $250,000 a day was successfully counterbalancing a multi-trillion-dollar economic superpower. Why did this micro-surcharge break the White House's political resolve? Because energy is deeply personal. An increase in steel prices is an invisible tax hidden inside the future cost of a vehicle or a structural beam. An electricity surcharge lands directly on the kitchen table every 30 days. It is an unavoidable monthly reminder of a failed trade policy, broadcast directly into the homes of 1.5 million voters in critical Rust Belt states. Doug Ford took advantage of this dynamic by launching a highly coordinated media blitz across CNN, Fox News, and major US networks, positioning himself as a reasonable partner defending his province against an irrational economic assault. He effectively decoupled the Canadian narrative from abstract trade statistics, transforming it into a direct conversation with the American voter about their own cost of living. The climb down and the hidden strategic shift by Tuesday, March 11th. The political and economic friction inside the White House became entirely unsustainable. The markets were in freefall, major industrial CEOs were forecasting mass layoffs, and voters in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York were staring at soaring utility bills. The breakthrough occurred when US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick bypassed traditional diplomatic channels and called Doug Ford directly. This call was the explicit strategic concession Ontario had been leveraging toward. Lutnick offered an immediate formal bilateral summit in Washington, D.C., scheduled for Thursday, March 13th, with the US trade representative present, specifically to negotiate a stabilized framework ahead of the critical April 2nd USMCA review deadline. In exchange for this immediate seat at the table, Ontario agreed to temporarily suspend the execution of the 25% electricity surcharge. Within hours of this agreement, the entire escalation cycle collapsed. The metal tariff withdrawal, the White House completely rescinded the threat of the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs, the official confirmation. The US trade apparatus confirmed to major networks that the retaliatory metal penalties were entirely off the table, reverting back to baseline global rates, while the White House press apparatus scrambled to frame this as a victory, claiming the president had successfully used leverage to bring a Canadian province to heel. The tactical reality was obvious to market eye. Insiders. The administration had been forced to drop a massive industrial tariff threat in exchange for a temporary pause on a provincial electricity fee, in a rare moment of candor outside the White House. The president admitted to reporters that Ford had agreed to pause the surcharge, noting quietly, "It would have been a very bad thing if he did." That single admission reveals the hidden power dynamic of the entire modern trade relationship. It would have been a catastrophic event for American infrastructure, not Canadian factories. The moment Washington acknowledged the severity of a potential grid disruption, they admitted that Canada possesses real, kinetic leverage that cannot be neutralized by a tariff memo. This leverage is the direct result of a century of integrated infrastructure planning. Canada supplies an overwhelming 90% of all electricity imported by the United States from any foreign nation. Independent analysis from organisations like the Centre for Strategic and International Studies highlighted that this cross-border grid provides North America with an unparalleled regional advantage. But its structural vulnerability lies in its absolute interdependence. A full Canadian power cutoff wouldn't just mean blackouts. It risked triggering cascading phase imbalances and structural failures across the entire eastern interconnection. An infrastructure disaster that doesn't stop at international borders. The real deep iceberg of Canadian energy when Doug Ford walked into the Commerce Department building in Washington on March 13th. Flanked by Federal Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, the geopolitical landscape of North America had fundamentally shifted. The 2-hour meeting did not result in a finalised, permanent treaty. Instead, it established a quiet, highly respectful truce. The surcharge was left suspended, not cancelled, and the Americans sat and listened. The grand irony of this entire trade conflict is that the electricity surcharge was merely the most visible tip of a much deeper, far more consequential energy iceberg. During a major television interview on March 10th, Ford casually dropped the true metric of Canadian economic leverage, noting that Canada sends 4.3 million barrels of crude oil to the United States every single day. He pointed out that when you remove energy from the equation, the United States actually runs a massive $56 billion trade surplus with Canada. The entire political narrative coming out of Washington, that Canada was somehow economically exploiting the United States through unfair trade, was completely dismal, led by the reality of America's own insatiable energy dependency. The physical numbers are undeniable. Energy commodity Canadian share of US inputs annual value 2024, crude oil 60%, 4.1 M to 4.3 M barrels, 124 billion electricity 90% of all foreign LA. Centricity imports included in aggregate natural gas, 100% of cross-border pipeline imports 27 billion total export. Total energy trade dominant supplier 151 billion total values. This is not a flexible, liquid market that the United States can easily diversify away from. The major heavy oil refineries of the American Midwest, most notably the massive BP Whiting facility in Indiana, have spent billions of dollars over decades specifically retooling their infrastructure to process heavy Canadian bitumen. They cannot efficiently run light Texan sweet crude or Permian Basin shale oil without catastrophic drops in refining capacity and months of hyper-expensive re-engineering. There is no immediate global alternative. Sourcing matching heavy grades from Venezuela or the Middle East involves immense shipping friction, maritime choke point vulnerabilities, and intense geopolitical instability. Canada's energy advantage is baked directly into the physical steel and concrete of American industrial infrastructure. The electricity surcharge was simply a highly visible, low-cost demonstration to prove that Ottawa and the provinces understand exactly how to turn those valves. The lesson of March 2025 is permanent. The surcharge was suspended, but the underlying regulatory framework was never dismantled. Ontario's grid operator retains the full administrative authority to reactivate the fee with minimal notice if trade negotiations break down again. Furthermore, Quebec and British Columbia have taken note of Ontario's success, quietly advancing their own legislative frameworks to allow for the rapid deployment of energy export surcharges. We have officially entered an era where raw physical control over indispensable supply chains trumps aggregate economic scale. Canada has demonstrated that it holds the keys to the factories, the heating systems, and the light switches of the American economy. But as the team sit down in Washington to redraft the long-term rules of North American trade, the most consequential question remains unanswered. That unanswered question hinges on the hidden structural mechanics of the agreement hashed out behind closed doors in Washington. To understand how a decentralized coalition of Canadian provinces forced a superpower to rewrite its trade strategy, we have to look past the political handshakes and dissect the specific architecture of the provisional deal struck on March 13, 2025. This was not a vague gentleman's agreement, it was a highly technical, multi-layered stabilization framework that remapped the legal and economic boundaries of the USMCA. The deal itself operates on three distinct levels: immediate tariff freezes, infrastructure immunity clauses, and the formal institutionalization of provincial energy leverage. By breaking down the specific mechanics of this arrangement, we can see exactly how the Canadian delegation converted a temporary utility surcharge into a permanent strategic buffer. The three pillars of the Washington Stabilization Framework, the architecture of the deal, can be dissected into four critical components, each designed to neutralize a specific vector of economic vulnerability. First, the immediate implementation of a bilateral tariff freeze. Under the terms negotiated by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and the Canadian ministerial team, the United States formally suspended its proposed 50% escalatory tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, reverting back to the baseline global import rate of 25%. In exchange, Ontario officially froze the execution of its $10 Canadian per megawatt-hour electricity surcharge. Crucially, the text of the provisional agreement specifies that this is a suspension, not a termination. The regulatory machinery established by Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator remains entirely intact. The billing codes are programmed, the accounting pathways are verified, and the administrative authority to reactivate the collection mechanism remains active. This creates a state of perpetual regulatory readiness, ensuring that if Washington breaches the core tenets of the truce, the $400,000 daily drain on the American Midwest can be toggled back on within a single billing cycle. Second, the creation of an infrastructure immunity clause. This is the most technically significant portion of the deal, yet it received the least amount of mainstream media coverage. The Canadian delegation successfully argued that critical energy infrastructure, specifically cross-border high-voltage transmission lines and international oil and gas pipelines, must be legally decoupled from standard commodity trade disputes. The text establishes a bilateral working group tasked with drafting an amendment to Chapter 11 of the USMCA. This amendment seeks to insulate primary energy flows from arbitrary executive tariff actions. The strategic logic here is profound. By securing a commitment to treat energy grids as national security assets rather than standard trade commodities, Canada effectively stripped Washington of its ability to use energy tariffs as a frontline weapon, while simultaneously preserving its own right to use domestic regulatory measures to manage supply. Third, the formal integration of provincial leadership into the pre-April 2nd USMCA review process. Historically, trade negotiations between Ottawa and Washington have been strictly federal affairs. The White House preferred this arrangement because it allowed them to apply centralized pressure on a single federal government by forcing a direct negotiation between a state governor equivalent like Doug Ford and the U.S. Commerce Department. The deal broke the federal monopoly on trade diplomacy. The architecture of the upcoming USMCA review has been altered to include a formal provincial state energy consultative mechanism. This means that Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia now possess a direct, institutionalized seat at the negotiating table, allowing them to defend their specific regional supply chains without waiting for federal authorization. Fourth, the establishment of an energy equivalence formula. To resolve the dispute over trade deficits, the technical teams designed a new accounting matrix that separates energy inputs from manufactured goods. Under this formula, the $124 billion worth of Canadian crude oil, natural gas, and electricity exported annually to the United States will no longer be counted as a structural trade imbalance to be corrected by punitive tariffs. Instead, it is classified as an essential industrial input, effectively neutralizing the statistical justification the White House used to launch the tariff war in the first place. The key players and the hidden financial math too truly appreciate the leverage dynamics at play. We must analyze the specific financial terms and the motivations of the key actors who engineered this architecture. The negotiation was driven by a triad of distinct forces: provincial executive power, federal diplomatic coordination, and American industrial self-preservation. On the Canadian side, the sequencing was a masterclass in good cop, bad cop diplomacy. Doug Ford acted as the kinetic disruptor, By operating at the provincial level, he was not bound by the same diplomatic constraints as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or federal ministers. He could issue blunt infrastructure threats that would be considered an act of diplomatic aggression if delivered by Ottawa, once the disruption achieved its intended market impact. Federal ministers Dominic LeBlanc and François-Philippe Champagne stepped in to formalise the deal architecture. They provided the technical expertise needed to translate Ford's raw leverage into binding trade text, ensuring that the province's independent action was seamlessly integrated into Canada's broader trade diversification strategy. On the American side, the key driver was not a sudden change of heart by the political executive, but intense, panicked lobbying from the corporate leadership of the American industrial core. While Howard Lutnick and the US Trade Representative signed the paperwork, the terms were effectively dictated by the balance sheets of Fortune 500 companies. Consider the financial reality confronting American utilities during those 48 hours of escalation. Companies like National Grid in New York, DTE Energy in Michigan, and Xcel Energy in Minnesota operate on tightly regulated profit margins. They rely on cheap, reliable baseload electricity from Ontario and Quebec to balance their regional grids during peak demand hours, had Ontario executed its threat of a complete power cutoff by early April. These utilities would have been forced to fire up expensive, inefficient fossil fuel peaker plants or purchase emergency power from adjacent US grids at hyperinflated spot prices. The cost of replacing Canadian electricity on the open market was estimated to be up to 5 times higher than the baseline import rate. This would have triggered an immediate financial crisis for regional utilities, forcing them to absorb millions in unrecoverable daily operating costs or petition state regulators for emergency rate hikes on voters. Furthermore, the doubling of the steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% threatened to break the back of the US automotive supply chain. Modern automotive manufacturing relies on a continuous, cross-border loop of parts and materials. An aluminum ingot cast in Quebec might be rolled in Ohio, machined in Ontario, and assembled into a vehicle in Michigan by imposing a 50% tax at each border crossing. The administration was effectively pricing American-made vehicles out of the global market. General Motors and Ford Motor Company were facing an estimated cost penalty of $1,100 to $20,500 per vehicle produced under the escalated tariff regime. It was this specific, quantified threat of industrial paralysis, relayed directly to Lutnick by automotive and aerospace executives, that forced the White House to abandon its escalatory stance and accept the provincial deal architecture. What this means for Canadian sovereignty. The structural terms of the Washington Framework represent a fundamental pivot in the history of North American trade diplomacy. For decades, the prevailing narrative assumed that Canada was the vulnerable partner in any trade dispute, completely dependent on access to the massive US consumer market. The deal architecture engineered in March 2025 completely inverts this power dynamic by successfully using an infrastructure surcharge to roll back a superpower's tariff policy. Canada demonstrated that its resource and energy networks are not vulnerabilities. They are primary strategic leverage points. The deal proves that when a middle power controls an irreplaceable node in a critical supply chain, it can successfully dictate terms to a dominant economic power. This is a massive win for Canadian economic sovereignty, providing a blueprint for how the country can protect its industrial base from future waves of protectionism. However, this New Deal architecture also introduces a complex internal dynamic within Canada itself. By demonstrating that a province can independently alter the course of national trade diplomacy, the event has fundamentally shifted the internal balance of power between Ottawa and the provinces. The provincial governments now know that they possess the physical tools to wage economic warfare independently, raising a critical question about the long-term unity of Canada's national trade strategy. The regional energy cards are now being dealt onto the table face up, and the continental grid is no longer just a system of wires and pipes. It is a highly sensitive geopolitical chessboard, and the first major match has just concluded with a profound structural shift. The immediate crisis has been contained, the surcharges are paused, and the industrial metals are flowing once again. But the strategic architecture of North American trade has been permanently rewired, leaving both sides to calculate their next moves in an entirely new economic landscape. But as the technical teams begin the grueling work of embedding these new principles into the text of the USMCA ahead of the review deadline, the most critical structural vulnerability of the entire agreement has been completely ignored by both sides. By engineering a tactical truce in Washington, Canada successfully demonstrated that its integrated energy networks could function as a rapid response asymmetric weapon capable of halting a superpower's blanket tariff policies. The resulting stabilization framework effectively decoupled vital energy infrastructure from routine commodity trade disputes, fundamentally altering the balance of power within North American economic diplomacy. When we zoom out to examine the broader strategic landscape, the implications of this showdown extend far beyond the electrical meters of the American Midwest. This moment marks the definitive end of the post-Cold War era of frictionless, rules-based continental trade. It replaces it with an era of resource nationalism, infrastructure weaponization, and raw transactional leverage. The death of the disinterested subsystem to fully appreciate the transformation under outspread view. Consider the pre-Trump era of Canada-US relations. For nearly 3 decades under the original NAFTA framework, cross-border infrastructure was treated as a politically neutral, technocratic subsystem. Power lines, oil pipelines, and natural gas networks were built to maximize commercial efficiency and reliability, operating quietly beneath the surface of diplomatic relations. Security was assumed, agreements were long-term, and borders were essentially invisible to the energy flowing through them. The 48-hour standoff in March 2025 shattered that assumption permanently. By utilising an administrative regulation under the Ontario Electricity Act to impose an explicitly discriminatory surcharge on American consumers, a Canadian province proved that physical connectivity is a double-edged sword. Infrastructure built for integration is inherently infrastructure built for vulnerability. www.aa.com.tar The global strategic takeaway is direct. In the modern geopolitical theatre, there is no longer any such thing as a politically neutral supply chain. Every wire, every pipeline, and every fibre optic cable crossing an international boundary represents a loaded economic weapon, waiting for a domestic executive with the political will to pull the trigger. This shifts Canada-US relations from a partnership based on shared continental values into a transactional relationship managed through mutually assured economic destruction. Washington now operates with the explicit awareness that an arbitrary executive assault on Canada's manufacturing sector can trigger an immediate retaliatory tax on the daily lives of American voters. The asymmetric leverage point has been validated in real time, and it cannot be unseen by trade strategists on either side of the border, the Continental Energy Doctrine for the broader global energy and trade sectors. This event provides an entirely new playbook for middle powers anchored to asymmetric economic superpowers. For years, nations have watched the United States utilize the weaponized dominance of the US dollar through swift sanctions and financial exclusions to compel international compliance. Ontario's maneuver demonstrated that resource-rich nations possess a matching physical counterweight, kinetic infrastructure dominance. This realization is already driving a profound realignment within Canada's internal political architecture, giving rise to what analysts are calling a continental Canadian energy doctrine. For the first time in modern Canadian history, the federal government and resource-rich provinces are aligning around a unified strategy to leverage their resource wealth for sovereign protection. The strategy is radiating across the country rapidly. Hydroelectric powerhouses, Hydro-Quebec, watching the success of Ontario's ISO regulation, has begun reviewing its long-term export structures to New England, ensuring that similar regulatory surcharge valves can be deployed if regional manufacturing assets face targeted US duties. Fossil fuel corridors, Western provinces, led by Alberta's massive 4.3 million barrel per day crude pipelines and British Columbia's natural gas export infrastructure, are evaluating legislative frameworks to mimic Ontario's emergency powers. This represents a structural shift from defensive trade litigation to offensive resource deterrence. The implications for international investors are immense. Capital allocation within the energy sector can no longer be evaluated purely on engineering feasibility or regional demand metrics. Strategic analysts must now price in infrastructure premium risks. The probability that a public utility network will be locked down or taxed to achieve a non-energy diplomatic outcome. The global chessboard and alliance fragility on the global stage. The brief border war of March 2025 exposes the profound structural fragility of Western alliances in an era of universal protectionism. When the United States treats its closest strategic partner and NATO ally as an economic adversary to be targeted with blanket tariffs, it signals to the rest of the world that traditional security arrangements provide zero immunity from transactional economic nationalism. This reality forces a fundamental reassessment of Canada's long-term trade diversification strategy. For decades, Canada's political class has talked casually about diversifying away from its near-total economic reliance on the US market, yet over 70% of Canadian exports continue to head south every year. The vulnerability of this arrangement was laid bare when a single executive action in Washington threatened to paralyze the domestic steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors overnight. True sovereignty requires physical alternatives. The Washington Truce bought Canada precious time, but it did not solve the systemic risk of geographic concentration. The escalation proved that as long as Canada's energy lines and industrial supply chains remain exclusively locked into a single, highly volatile neighbour, its economic survival will remain hostage to the political shifting winds of Washington. The real solution requires building the physical infrastructure necessary to route Canadian critical minerals, energy, and clean power directly to global markets. Bypassing the American bottleneck entirely, the impending crucible, the temporary suspension of the electricity surcharge and the rolling back of the 50% metal duties were not a final peace treaty. They were merely an intermission. The entire architecture of North American economic integration is rapidly moving toward its next critical crucible. The mandatory review deadline of the USMCA, the true test of the March 2025 stabilization framework, will not be decided in a corporate boardroom or a provincial legislature. It will be written into the text of the revised trilateral agreement. Washington will undoubtedly attempt to use the upcoming negotiations to strip Canada of its infrastructure leverage, demanding explicit legal clauses that prohibit provinces from ever again manipulating cross-border utility flows during trade disputes. Conversely, Ottawa and the provinces must fight to formalise and protect those exact regulatory levers, embedding resource sovereignty directly into the core of the continental trade apparatus. The lines have been drawn, the weapons have been trialled, and both sides now understand the exact location of the opponent's critical vulnerabilities.